David, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me. We made the diaries work and the time zones all aligned.
Glad to be here. Glad it worked out.
And I recently read that you were celebrating over a year back in March of a year of everything is bullshit over on Substack. But the question that comes to mind when you hear that word and that term is, why is everything bullshit?
Well, I think everything is bullshit for a few reasons. The first reason is that we don't really have access to the true reasons why we do things. We can't just introspect and understand the all of the causes that led to our behavior. Basically, we have these feelings and these perceptions, and then we take these feelings and perceptions and we come up with a plausible, nice sounding story for why it is that we did what we did. But we don't actually know the truth. And this is a result of decades of research in psychology and neuroscience. Basically, we're just making up a story that makes us look good, or that helps us get what we want from other people, and then it's biased in all sorts of ways. And so, in that sense, whenever we're talking about the reasons for our behavior, what we're doing is a kind of bullshitting. And that the goal is not necessarily to pick out the true psychologically correct reasons for our behavior, but to say something that sounds good or that gets us what we want or that makes us look good, um, or that other people will find convincing, even if it's total BS. Um, so that's what happens when we talk about our own behavior. When we try to explain other people's behavior, we're even more in the dark than when we try to explain our own behavior, because at least with our own behavior, we have access to the sights and sounds that make up our conscious experience. When we're trying to explain why someone else did what they do, well, we have none of that. And so our stories about why other people do what they do are even more full of shit than the stories we tell about ourselves. And so if you reflect on the fact that really most of what we talk about revolves around the reasons why people do things, the reasons why we ourselves do things, the reasons why other people do things, the reasons why our political opponents vote the way they do, the reason why this so-and-so celebrity had an affair with another celebrity or whatever. Most of our conversations revolve around these reasons for behavior. And if you reflect on the fact that most of these reasons are bullshit, that we really don't know what we're talking about, we don't really know what the true reasons are, then it makes sense that pretty much everything we talk about is bullshit.
It's a phrase that for the UK listener is not as commonly used, but it can sometimes be linked to lying. But I know you distinguish quite clearly between bullshit and lying, and they are by no means the same thing.
Yeah, I view them as very different. You could think of the relationship between murder and manslaughter as similar to the relationship between lying and bullshitting. When you murder someone, you intentionally kill them. When you manslaughter, you just behave negligently and you accidentally kill someone, but it wasn't necessarily your intention. You just didn't really care about the consequences of your actions. I view bullshitting as a kind of negligence, a particular kind of epistemic negligence or negligence about the truth. It's not that you know the truth and you're deliberately telling a falsehood to hide something. It's that you don't necessarily even know what's true. And even if you did know, you don't really care. The truth is just not a concern to you. It's not the goal of your communication. The goal of your communication is not to accurately describe reality in as much detail as possible to the person you're talking to. The goal is to warp and bias and exaggerate or minimize reality in whatever way you need to do to get what you want from the person you're talking to, whether it's status, sympathy, approval, forgiveness, whatever.
I think it's really valuable that you've used the S word already, status. And I mentioned to you when we were getting organized for this that I'd hosted Will Storr on the podcast, and his book, The Status Game, was a real red pill, but also like quite an empowering bit of information about just how we're wired. And he used a lot of the same language as you, David. You'll laugh. He actually said the brain isn't a machine for detecting the truth. The brain's a storyteller. And that's exactly as you said there, in terms of we don't really truly know the drivers that are pushing us to make certain decisions or that are making others make decisions in their actions. But we have some sort of story that we build or construct around it that makes the most possible sense to us and usually serves us best as well. Now, of course, there's people that have extremely negative self-talk about why they do the things they do, but they're probably in the minority when it comes to these things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm a big fan of Will Storr's book. I think he gets a lot right. Um, And I particularly like his use of the word storytelling. I think he's right that these are stories that we're telling each other. As far as I know, he coined the term status game. I'm not sure if anyone used that phrase before him. I think it's a beautiful phrase that is really powerful and insightful. I think it's really useful to think about status as a game with rules, with points, with winners and losers. And I think if you understand status dynamics in terms of game theory and the strategies that people pursue and how those strategies are affected by the strategies that other people are pursuing, that can be a really insightful way to look at status dynamics.
I guess when you zoom out and you take a not a third person, but like to use like a wanky corporate term, a helicopter view of some of the decisions we make, it can be helpful to understand that people are making these decisions or these actions based on driving towards status. If we can't explain anything else they're doing, at least we can be like, oh, well, the reason that he voted that way or the reason that he bought that item or that he flexed that item on Instagram or whatever he chose to do was because he was looking to gather status in the hierarchy and move forward. And it's a much easier, like it's almost like a razor to cut through some of the nonsense that we see.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. If there's anything that decades of scientific research and social science and evolutionary biology have told us, it's that status is a very important human motivation. It's not just an important motivation for humans; it's a motivation for social animals everywhere. Being high in rank, having other animals defer to you in conflicts. That is an extremely important resource. It's highly correlated with survival and reproduction in a bunch of different species, including humans, including our closest primate relatives. Status is more complicated in humans. It's not just dominance and the ability to use force, but it's also the ability to recruit allies and mobilize supporters in conflicts. That's something that you only see in animals like chimpanzees or dolphins, where they're a little more socially intelligent and they can mobilize supporters. And in that case, status is less about your brawn or your raw physical formidability, and more about your political power, your connections to other people, their loyalty to you, how many allies you have, how loyal they are to you, etc. And I think humans have taken that to a huge extreme, where the vast majority of our status has nothing to do with our physical strength. It has to do with our social connections, and has to do with what other people think of us. And those perceptions can be extremely fragile. They can collapse at any moment. If everyone all of a sudden realizes that I'm awesome and realizes that everyone else realizes that I'm awesome, well, then I become awesome, even if I actually suck. But as soon as people start to catch on to the fact that maybe I'm not so awesome, and maybe they start to suspect other people of suspecting that I'm not so awesome, well, then my status can collapse literally like an economic bubble. Um, so status is much more complicated and paradoxical and dynamic in humans than it is in other animals. But I think the fundamental importance of it is the same, and that it is just as highly correlated with survival and reproduction in hunter-gatherer societies as it is in other animal species. Um, so I think the relevance of status to explaining all sorts of our motivations is going to be high, even if we pretend that it's not high. And that's another interesting thing that I like to talk about, is that we often gain status by pretending that we don't care about status. That is, um, behaving as if we're interested in some other high-minded goal and not status is actually the best way of getting status. Um, and that creates a lot of weird paradoxes in our status games, and that's what leads them to be so weird and ever changing and volatile, and why they're so different across times and places. Because if there's a paradox at the heart of status, well, then there's a fragility to status as well, because as soon as it becomes widely known that I'm just a narcissistic, vain, selfish status seeker, well, then all of a sudden I lose status. So the only way for us to collectively compete for status is to create the illusion that that's not what we're doing. And as soon as we see
There's elements of it being covert.
exactly, yeah, as soon as we see through the illusion, then the game collapses and we have to do something else to gain status.
I think there's so much within that, David. But one of the things that you mentioned there is that it has to be covert and it has to be slightly hidden that you're seeking to gain status. But I do know that there's elements of certain traditional means still infer status, but not so much as they once did. So, for example, wealth, income, social connections, and like where you sit within the hierarchy. But if you're seen to be a social climber, for example, and it's very clear what your intentions are, and maybe you're posting very materialistic things on social media, or you're being overtly materialistic in how you dress or how you present yourself or what you buy, then that can, as you say, it can actually reduce your status within the overall picture, because people are almost like, oh, he's trying too hard, or that's what he's trying to do.
Exactly. Yeah. What do we call it when someone wants lots of money? We call them greedy, and we think that's bad. So greed is bad, even though money is, among the most useful things for a person to have, but it's completely understandable that you would want as much of it as possible because it helps you get more and more of what you want in life. So it's understandable that you would want the thing that helps you get what you want. And yet, the desire for money is seen as immoral. There's some interesting psychology research showing that people who have what's seen as too much money are looked down upon. They're shamed in a lot of cultures. We have a lot of envy of the wealthy and hostility to the wealthy. We have a lot of hostility toward people we see as greedy, who are self-serving, or who are only in it for the profit. And that's another paradox you see in the business world. In order to selfishly maximize profit, you cannot be seen as selfishly maximizing profit. That's why corporations always have to have a high-minded, altruistic, beautiful mission statement about what they're really trying to do.
Mission
Yeah,
statement.
they're trying to serve their communities. They have values of diversity and integrity, and they're trying to make the world a better place. I think Starbucks' mission statement is to enrich the human spirit, one cup of coffee at a time. So corporations are always coming up with these high-minded mission statements because they can't just come out and say we want to make as much money as possible. Because if they say that, well, they won't make as much money as possible, right?
It would make us uncomfortable, wouldn't it?
Yes,
Yeah, that's it's a really interesting, as you say, it's paradoxical, where you cannot be seen to overtly be driving towards the real goal, which is accruing maximum status. Instead, you must try and hide or conceal that through some form of, whether it's altruistic or whether it's even dominance. I know that's a big part. Like, if you become a dominant player, people almost respect you more than if you become a statesful player. But the two are intrinsically linked. If you're the most dominant coffee shop or the most dominant football team, then people have a level of respect and understanding. But if you were to say, like, oh, I'm trying to become the most dominant coffee brand because I want to be statusful, it would completely warp our perception of it.
exactly. Yeah, to overtly seek dominance as the only thing that you want is to lower your chances of getting dominance. So no politician comes out and says, "I just want to dominate people. I just want to boss people around and tell them what to do. I just want power for its own sake. I don't really have any values or care about making the world better. I just, me, me, me. Just give me power so that I can, power trip." No one says that, right? And in the same reason, the people, political activists don't say that. I just want political power. I just want to boss people around for the thrill of it. And yet, ultimately, that's what politicians and political activists end up getting. They end up getting political power. They end up getting the ability to boss people around and tell them they what to do. And so there's a paradox in politics as well, where your goal cannot be dominance. It has to be something else. It has to be something pretty and nice sounding. And so that's another area where we have to come up with bullshit stories in order to get the ugly, darker thing that we want, that we can't admit we want.
Yes, the manifestos would never say, like, our goal is to win as many seats as possible and have control over the House of Commons or the Parliament, and then to enact whatever we decide to do. It's very much, they set out what their mission is, what their goals are, what their visions are for society, and a fairer society, or a cleaner society, or a greener society, whatever term is the most endearing at that moment in time, depending on the kind of geopolitical situation. It's really funny how there's that very, like, cloak and dagger approach to it. And I know you actually write about buried
Mhm.
signals. How would you describe those?
Sure. A buried signal is a signal you send where you reduce the likelihood of it being detected by the recipient. And you think buried signaling is a weird thing to do, but it can evolve under a certain set of conditions. And those conditions are if burying the signal increases the benefits of the signaler among the people who do detect it, then that can outweigh the costs of burying the signal. So let's say I donate to charity anonymously versus conspicuously. And let's say, like, maybe one or two people, somehow figure out that it was me who donated anonymously. If they give me way more status for donating anonymously, then that could offset the costs of burying the signal. And it is true that we tend to valorize anonymous donors more than conspicuous donors. Someone puts their name on a building, we're like, oh, what a show off, what a narcissist. But if they donate anonymously, we say, oh, wow, wow, what a good person. So it's true that we do give more status to the inconspicuous altruist than to the conspicuous altruist. And if you factor those costs and benefits into the decision to send the signal, well, in some cases, it can actually pay to bury the signal to get those benefits of being seen as an inconspicuous altruist.
Absolutely. And I was thinking before we hit record about some of the examples of buried signals, and like a really unusual one that I was thinking about was at networking events, perhaps table manners, or like how you conduct yourself at the table in terms of your how you use the knives and forks and how they're set up, and um how you maybe pass on the starter platter or whatever is happening. And like these are signs that you are from a statusful background, perhaps in terms of you know what to do and how to conduct
Mhm.
yourself. Whereas maybe somebody who's new to that environment may have the same rank of job as you or the same rank of income as you, but hasn't had that same societal upbringing that puts them comfortable in that position. So I was thinking about, it's a buried signal, not intentionally, but perhaps evolutionary it's intentionally, that we know how to conduct ourselves in that space. So that person automatically, if you know, you look at him, and you say, "Oh yeah, he's using his spoon correctly for the soup course and his fork correctly for the fish course." And these are ways that they are signaling that they are statusful in some
hmm
sense.
So what you're talking about is a subtly different thing called covert signaling. And I sometimes confuse these two
Okay.
because they're extremely similar. They might even be identical. I'd have to think more about it. But covert signaling is when you send a signal that only some people get, but other people don't get. So if you tell a joke that only people in your subculture get, but the people who are not in your subculture don't get, that's a covert signal because some people are receiving the signal and some people are not. And you could think of that as a kind of varying and reducing the probability that people detect it is similar to alienating a subset of people who definitely won't get it. They're kind of similar. But in the case of etiquette, I think that would be more of a covert signal where the people who are upper class are more likely to see whether the arrangement of forks and knives and plates and so forth is correct. Whereas if you're from a lower class background, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between, a salad fork and a dinner fork, or whether things are in the right position or not. So it's a signal that people are only going to receive if they're well acquainted with the norms of etiquette in upper class society.
That joke example you give is really interesting. For example, you could make a joke that was related to like an intellectual text that you and your peer group will definitely have read, depending on what course you've studied at university, or it would be like a cultural reference. So I spoke to Rob Henderson before. I'm sure you're aware of his work. He was talking about at Cambridge, for example, and at Harvard, some of the students would make jokes about particular television programs that they watched from the class they were from. Whereas him growing up in foster care, there was like particular shows that he loved and watched, but none of the in jokes or none of the little phrases or quips that they used were from that environment.
hmm
So I think it's quite funny that you can covertly signal what status you have or you have had previously based on the level of joke you can refer to or the cultural phenomenons you can bring up.
Yeah, absolutely. A good example of this is books that lots of people buy but nobody reads. So, Amazon actually keeps records of like if you buy a Kindle book and like how far you make it into the book. And there's a list of these books that are, really popular and everyone buys them, but no one actually reads them. And I remember some of the top widely purchased but unread books were Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, and Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. And you can understand why people would want to be seen as the type of person who would buy those types of books. Capital in the 21st Century, is a sophisticated book in economics. It signals your progressive bona fides, that, you're a person who cares about inequality and you want to learn about it. But if you actually read it, it's actually pretty dense and complicated and boring. The same thing goes for A Brief History of Time. It's supposed to, Stephen Hawking's supposed to be a renowned physicist who overcame adversity and came up with these brilliant ideas. But if you actually read it, it's pretty complicated and boring, and it's kind of a slog. And so these are books that people want to be seen as having read rather than actually read. And you can think of that as a covert signal. So if I name drop Thomas Piketty in a discussion, some members of that discussion are going to know what I'm talking about. They're going to know who Thomas Piketty is. They're going to know that he wrote Capital in the 21st Century. They're going to know that the basic thesis is inequality bad. and they're going to give me status points. Whereas the people who don't know who Thomas Piketty is, they're going to be alienated, confused, uh, and that allows me to sort of covertly hobnob with the high status people I want to connect with, while subtly excluding people who I don't want to connect with without overtly saying you're an idiot or you suck. That's the
Yeah,
genius of it.
you wouldn't get it. You don't. You're not clued up enough to understand what I'm hinting at. That's so funny, and I know one of the ways that we can signal status is through our virtue. And I think there was times during 2020 in particular where people maybe would have signaled that maybe read like I don't know Ibrahim Kendi's book or something that was like like clearly anti-racist or anti like colonial, whatever terms we want to use. And if they would maybe say like, "Oh, I've read this book," that would infer that they were up to date with the latest virtuous texts and phrases and knowledge that they should have, like particularly around the times of what BLM and the kind of the summer of 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what's interesting about this is in order to pull off this strategy, in order to know all the right tidbits and pieces of information to allow you to covertly connect with the people you want to connect with while excluding the dum-dums that you don't want to connect with. In order to pull off that strategy, well, you have to be interested in that information in the first place. You know, you have to be driven to seek out these arbitrary tidbits and these little meaningless phrases, and you have to be motivated to actually go to the store and pick up Ibram Kendi's book or order it on Amazon. You have to be motivated to know all the buzzwords and the phrases. And so, what that suggests is that our appetite for information is driven more by these uglier social motives than we'd like to think. We like to think that what makes something interesting is its truth value and its usefulness. But in fact, oftentimes what makes things interesting is its usefulness in helping us play status games.
That is such a good point. Like I should know this because I'll be able to at the party or at the event talk about the things that will indicate that I'm
Mhm.
statusful. If I don't read the latest book or if I don't read the latest blog or if I'm not following the right Twitter accounts or if even like the mad world way the world is now, if I'm not like up to date with the latest funny phrases and trends on TikTok, then I could be excluded from particular social groups and like not noticed as somebody that is of a high ranking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, if we were truly just purely interested in acquiring the most true, accurate, and useful information out there on the internet, what are the odds that we would focus on the news? You know, the vast majority of useful, true things are things that we already know, are things, history, economics, medical science, whatever, and they've been known for many decades. They've been corroborated and replicated multiple times. The truest and most useful things are old, and they're the conventional wisdom, and yet we find those things the most boring, and yet we are constantly reading what is new. We want to keep up with the news. Why are we so focused on what's new and so bored by what's old? Well, because part of our goal of acquiring information is to fit in with other people, and we read the news because everyone else reads the news, and we don't want to be left out of conversations about the news. Um, so I have a post called "You Will Find This Interesting" that tries to unpack, what it is that drives our appetite for information. What is it that makes something interesting? And I contrast the high-minded story we tell, where we just want to acquire wisdom and knowledge and truth for its own sake, with the uglier narrative that really what we're doing when we're interested in something is we're playing ugly social and coalitional games. And what that suggests to me, at least, is that interesting stuff is overrated. I think we ought to, learn to appreciate things that are boring more than we do, and we need to stop valorizing what is interesting.
It would probably make us, and I don't want to use the term happier because you're going to tell me off for that, but it would maybe make us more satisfied if we went into the things which we truly care about and not just things that are interesting in the moment or at that time that are going to serve us further down the line. So by opting out of the games to some extent, we'll talk about if that's even possible, you can have an information diet which is actually more in line with what you truly want to do and what to learn about rather than what you think you should want to learn about based on societal norms or pressures.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, maybe if you're not as pressured into, picking up the Ibram Kendi book or the Thomas Piketty book, you might read something that is genuinely satisfying to you. Maybe you'll read a novel that you wouldn't have otherwise read, and maybe you'll read a novel that no one else has read, and you won't be able to talk about with anyone else. But just the sheer joy of reading the novel, will make your life better. Um, so yeah,
Cool.
I think. Um, it's probably true that if we try to resist the pull of the interesting, that will probably be better for us.
If we choose to care less about status, or at least tell ourselves that we do, can that make us more statusful? So if I perhaps signal that I'm not too bothered about status, can it elevate me?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the main ways that we gain status is by denying that we care about status. Um, that's like the central paradox of status seeking. It's why when we pursue status, we often have to pursue the opposite of it. So instead of pursuing dominance, what we present ourselves as doing is rebelling against dominance. Instead of being the dominator, we see ourselves as the revolutionary, the rebel that is trying to overthrow the dominator, right? And that gives us an excuse, a rationalization to dominate. The same thing goes with status. Instead of seeking achievements to show that we're better than other people, we care about humility. I often find it interesting that people say that they're humbled by their achievements, when in reality the achievement should be doing the opposite. It should be making you, more boastful.
It's
Yeah,
inflating
it
you.
should be inflating you,
Yes.
right? But we have to say that, oh, it's humbling us because we have to be pursuing the opposite of what we're actually pursuing in order to get it. So we care about things like humility, resistance to authority, um, etc. And that is what helps us get the opposite of humility and the opposite of resistance to authority.
Something I've been thinking about is like my own drivers for doing a podcast like this one. Now, the story that I would tell myself and that I will try and stick to some extent is that I'm extremely process driven.
Mhm.
I like having conversations with interesting people like yourself, like Rob Henderson, like Will Storr, like Chris Williamson, whoever has been on the show. I really enjoy these things. And I know that it serves a purpose for people in the demographic of my listenership, which is mostly guys aged 25 to 35. Now, don't get me wrong, there's lots of outliers in and around about that. But it serves them, and the messages I get from them telling me that they've enjoyed things, or, oh, when I listened to that episode with David Pinsof, I really learned this, and now I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And that feels great. But I didn't pursue it to be like a top 1% podcast, although that's now the tagline. I didn't pursue it to get a new sponsorship deal, which is round the corner and it's got a fiscal return to it. So I guess it's difficult for me to think about what my drivers were from a status perspective to host the podcast versus what my drivers were from an enjoyment perspective for myself and what I get up to in terms of these wonderful conversations, but then the sort of ripple effect being positive off the back of it.
Yeah. So when I say that, a lot of our motives are driven by status, I definitely don't mean that they're consciously driven by status.
Okay.
I think most of the time we are not aware of how these motives are shaping our behavior. And I think that is in large part by design. Because if we gain status by convincing other people that we don't care about status, well, then the best way to convince other people is by convincing ourselves. And so a lot of what we do is we try to convince ourselves that we're more noble and altruistic and humble than we actually are, so that we can more successfully convince other people that we're more humble and noble and non-selfish than we are. And I don't know if you've ever talked to yourself or done something wrong and tried to convince yourself that it actually wasn't so bad. But I certainly have this experience. A lot of other people have this experience. And I think what we're doing in that situation where we try to convince ourselves that it really wasn't so bad is we're preparing for the scenario when we are challenged by someone else that it was bad. Right, we're rehearsing it in advance so that when someone comes out and accuses us of doing something wrong, we have a list of ready-made excuses. Right, we know exactly what to say. We have the right story, the right rationalization, and we don't hesitate, and we can deliver it smoothly and convincingly. So I think a lot of our bullshitting is not merely directed at other people, but directed at ourselves, so that we can prepare and rehearse for the bullshit that will inevitably be delivered to other people.
Yeah, great point. And it's funny because I don't know if a podcast is the best vehicle for growing your status massively, because some people love the idea of you doing a podcast, but then a lot of people are like, oh, that's nerdy, that's dorky, or that's very time consuming for the return on it. Because I'm 4 years into the podcast. I absolutely love the conversations that I get to have, but it's by no means a huge revenue generator or anything like that. Whereas I think there's maybe other vehicles where you could create content and you would quite quickly see some of the more obvious statusful rewards that would come with it, whether that's wealth or whether that's being perhaps more even more well known, perhaps.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's tricky though, because if you were to single-mindedly, explicitly, and consciously and monomaniacally seek wealth, well, you're going to be unlikely to actually get rich, or at least if people catch on to that, the fact that you're doing that. Um, so if I host a podcast where I bring in all sorts of cheesy ads, and they come in every like 2 seconds, and I bring on people who are obviously giving me money, and I just flatter them and kiss their asses the whole time. Like, no one's going to want to listen to that podcast, right? People are only going to want to listen to the authentic podcast where you bring in people who you find genuinely interesting, where you're learning quote unquote valuable lessons. Um, so I'm not sure that it's possible to directly seek the wealth and fame uh, that we all want. I think there always has to be an alternative goal, or at least an alternative framing for it, in order for us to successfully get there. And I don't want to, belittle you or accuse you of having unsavory motives. Just to level the playing field, I have these same motives too. We all do. Um, I don't think it's bad or anything to be ashamed of. I think we need to work on coming to terms with it as a species. Um, but I think it's good to be honest about it. And it's also good to realize that even if you don't see it in yourself, that doesn't mean it's not there. Because I think its invisibility to
Correct.
us is a design feature. Um, so oftentimes we introspect on our own motives and say, oh, I don't care about status. That's not what I'm really after. I just want to make the world a better place. And it feels really true. It
Mm.
feels right, you know? But we overestimate how reliable this introspection is. Introspection is bullshit. It doesn't actually give you the true answer. It just, uh, we don't have the true answer. It's not in there, right? Uh, so I think we're often deluded by our powers of introspection into thinking that we truly understand ourselves. And I think it can be helpful to realize that we often don't, and be open-minded about the possibility that the real things driving our behavior are perhaps more unflattering than we think.
More unflattering, we think. I think that's the key term, isn't it? And I think if what you do has a positive ripple effect, even if the deep down most base level reason is to seek status, at least you can try and help some people along the way. Will was saying when I interviewed him that he was doing work with the Samaritans, which is a charity in the UK,
Hmm.
and he was like, I know that deep down I'm doing this because it makes me be viewed as a virtuous, good person,
Hmm.
but at least I'm actually having conversations with people who are either struggling with finance or suicidal ideation or divorce or childcare or all these different challenges that come up in their life. He's like, at least with my attempt at being statusful, I can gain some sort of support or value for people who need it and help them at their time of need. So I do think there's different games we can play, isn't there,
Yes.
which have a positive impact, all the while still knowing that in some way or another we're trying to climb the hierarchy within those games. So whether that's the charity field or whether that's the
Yeah.
the podcasting field, maybe there's thousands of people that benefit from having the conversations, but deep down my little evolutionary chimp brain is telling me, Colin, produce these podcasts because then you're going to get into the top 0.5% rather than the top 1%.
Right. No, absolutely. That's very well put. I think the right way to think of it is not seeking status versus not seeking status, because we have no choice in that. Like, we cannot renounce our desire for status any more than we can renounce our desire to eat or sleep or breathe. Right. This is a basic human motive. It's a part of human nature. We cannot get rid of it. The best we can do is harness it in better or worse directions. We can play better or worse status games. And the only way to figure out whether we're playing a particularly good status game or a particularly bad status game is to wake up and realize that we're actually playing a status game. That's the only way that we can gain the amount of awareness and self insight in order for us to actually navigate these status games in a better or worse way.
I like that, David. I really do. And one of the like really positive points that you put forward that I've read around is we can see a more positive outlook on our status if we can compare ourselves favorably with what's come before us intergenerationally. So if myself as a millennial can look back and see my trajectory and path being of a comparably favorable level to my parents or my grandparents, then I can be happier or happier and more content. I find that really interesting because if you look at millennials and Gen Z, we're one of the first generations or two generations where we're almost looking back like angrily at the generation before. Not me personally, but I think a lot of my peers would maybe be like, oh well, they bought a house sooner than I did, they got married sooner than I did, they had a better bull market in their investment and their returns. Like, I'm so annoyed by what's come before me. That must have a negative impact on this generation's status.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think that outcompeting the older generations for status and living standards is one of the best things we can do to make the world better. And the moment we stop outcompeting our elders is the moment that society starts to unravel, or at least that's the thesis that I argue for in my post. We must outcompete our elders. Uh, and the idea is that if status is such an important motivation in humans, and status is relative, meaning that you can't really get status in an absolute sense. It's just about being better than you. So uh, we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people. If I have um, a Porsche, you won't get status unless you have an even better car. If I have, a big house, you'll want a bigger house, right? And so we'll get increasingly more and more awesome things, awesome houses, awesome cars, awesome food, and living standards. But we will never be satisfied because we'll still just be comparing ourselves to the people around us, right? What that suggests is that it's impossible to give everyone what they want, because what everyone wants is to be better than everyone else, but everyone can't be better than everyone else by definition, right? So what that suggests is that really we're kind of doomed, that we're not really going anywhere as a species. We're not like moving toward like happiness for everyone. We're just going to keep competing with each other for status until the end of time, and there's no happy ending to the human condition, right? So that's a really dark and depressing thought. And as soon as I had that thought, I'm like, oh shit, is there any way out of this doom spiral? Is there any kind of loophole? And I thought about it, and I realized that there actually is a loophole. And the loophole is outcompeting the previous generation. So if you think about it, what we all want is to be better than someone else, right? But the problem is that someone else is going to be unhappy because they want to be better than us too. So is there a way that we can all be better than someone else when the someone else is okay with that? I thought about it and I realized there is one case, and that's when the someone else is the older generation. Because the older generation wants the younger generation to outcompete them, because the younger generation contains their children and grandchildren. So, from a Darwinian perspective, they want them to be doing really, really well, right? So, outcompeting the previous generation is really the only case where we can all outcompete someone and that someone is okay with it. And so, that's really the only case where we can all win as a society. And I think
I think the term loophole is so important that you've used there, David, because as you say, what's allowing that to be the case is that evolutionary, we want our lineage to be successful, we want it to be well supported, we want it to do well. And if that means that they have a better career path or a better house
yeah,
or a better car, then that actually makes us happy. Whereas if it was our neighbor of the same generation, same status, not family related, get that friction point where we want to keep up with the Joneses, we want to get the BMW because he's got the BMW, we want to get the Rolex watch because he's got the Rolex watch. It's so much harder to see somebody who's not your lineage and of your same generation succeed. I think that's a fascinating insight to actually zoom out and be like, okay, how can we make this work? And it's trying to enable that younger generation to do better. And I guess that's maybe why some of the anger at previous generations is there in today's millennials and Gen Zs.
yeah, absolutely. If we're constantly competing with our peers for status to get, the nicer Rolex or whatever, um, but our parents were living in shtetls, then we can at least say, hey, at least I'm better off than my parents. At least I'm not living in a shtetl. Even if I don't have the nice Rolex, is okay. But if my parents have a nicer Rolex than me too, or if they have a bigger house than me and my peers have a bigger house than me, well, then I'm screwed. I'm humiliated. I'm depressed. I'm going to run amok in society. So I think you start to see serious problems when any segment of society stops outcompeting the previous generation. And I think that is responsible for a lot of the disaffection, the alienation, the political extremism, that has been arising in the US and other places. What you get is when one part of society, and usually this is concentrated among people who are less educated because of the educational arms races that have been happening over time. We're less educated in smaller towns, or it might have to do with increases in housing costs. The previous generations were able to afford a house. Now housing is so scarce that you can no longer afford it. So all these changes have basically caused the younger generation in a lot of places in America to be worse off than the previous generation. And I think that has caused an extreme amount of anger and resentment and problems for society.
It's that whole humiliation piece that Will and even yourself speaks about, where if you feel like your status has been diminished, there's almost nothing worse
Yeah.
than that. Like, he gives the whole example of Elliot Rodger. He talks about certain like neo Nazis throughout history as well that have lashed out because they felt their status undermined. Like, incels have been so rejected by society and their status has been so low. They're like, okay, well, I'm going to turn to the ultimate act of violence or hurt to make people understand that I am actually a powerful, dominant individual as well. So it's a really big consideration that the most important thing for society is continued progress of, and people can call me a red-blooded capitalist in this respect, but of wealth and of opportunity for the next generation. And that, and interestingly, you brought up education. I think that's going to be an interesting one because in the UK, there's been such a push for my generation to all go to university. Like Tony Blair famously set a target of 50% of school leavers to go to university, which in reality is a little bit ridiculous because so many of the courses that we just created and magicked up and pushed people through with all the different debt that comes with it weren't really equipping people for the job market. So yes, we gave them this nice fancy certificate from a college that we suddenly christened a university, and we said, "Look, that's you. You've succeeded." The actual trappings of a master's or a bachelor's or an honors degree from previous has been devalued by that. So we can't just keep pushing for more and more university graduates. We need to be pushing for progress in the real world, which sounds really vague, doesn't it? But in the real world outside of academia.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. I would love to write a post called "Education is Bullshit," but the economist Brian Kaplan has already written that post in a book-length form called "The Case Against Education." I highly recommend it. It's very good. I agree with it wholeheartedly. Um, the argument he makes in that book is that education is about signaling conformity, intelligence, and work ethic. And it's not about creating those virtues in people. It doesn't make you smarter or more hardworking or more conformist. It gives you a stamp on your forehead if you are those things, right? It makes you jump through a variety of arbitrary hoops to see whether you have what it takes to jump through those arbitrary hoops. And if you can jump through the hoops, then you get the stamp for being able to jump on the hoops, and then you look very attractive to employers who want to make you jump through their hoops, right? That's basically what education is. It's an elaborate signaling system to get people to show that they have the right stuff to work for high status employers, right? It's not actually teaching you things that will be helpful in your job, or at least for the most part, it's not. Most of what you learn in school you forget. It's arbitrary, largely useless. There are a few things that are useful, like reading and writing. That's obviously useful. Basic math is useful, but beyond like the basic stuff like that, um, most of education is wasteful signaling, and investing in it is bad because all that's going to do is just pour more fuel into the fire. It's just going to increase the arms race because if everyone has a college degree, well, now I need a graduate degree to outshine my competitors. And now if everyone has a graduate degree, now I need a PhD to outshine my competitors. And so we're just going to keep on sinking more and more time and energy of the youngest, most energetic, most productive people in society into this wasteful arms race instead of channeling the youthful energy of those people into doing productive activities for society. And so I'm a believer that education is bullshit. We have too much education. We valorize it way too much. We invest way too much in it. I think we need less education. If we must have education, we should have very precise, targeted vocational training and not education. We should have apprenticeships where you get on the job training because that's the best kind of learning. You're not going to learn how to do your job better by learning Socrates. You're going to learn how to do your job better by actually doing the job. Yeah, end of rant. But that's my view on that.
I enjoyed the rant, David, and I'm interested in it, albeit you're not going to write the same length of book as the other gentleman, but I'd be interested in your writing on it because, of course, at college you co-founded the game Cards Against Humanity, which many of the listeners will be familiar with. How did you? I mean, maybe you weren't enjoying your time at college. So you decided that a game was the best um, energy and vehicle for your productivity. But how did that come around?
Honestly, it came around for fun. So my friends and I, we like to play games. We like to make games together. One of our favorite activities was putting dirty words in the blanks of Mad Libs, and we thought it'd be fun to just take the fill in the blank sentences and just deconstruct them, and make a game out of it. And so we originally just made the game for ourselves. We just wanted something fun that we could play with each other. And we played it at a New Year's party with some friends, and it was a big, it was a big hit. And because there was so much demand for it, people kept asking us for copies of it. We eventually put it online for free for people to download. And so for a while, I think it was maybe 3 years or so, it was just online for free. Anyone could download it, print it out, and it just kind of took off from there. People just downloaded it and played it with their friends, and then their friends got it, and it just became kind of this viral underground thing. And then we did a Kickstarter campaign to actually print it out on official cards and put it in a nice box and with instructions and everything. And then we raised a ton of money. We were one of the first like Kickstarter success stories, and the rest is history.
From what you understand about how we're wired, what do you put the success of the game down to?
Interesting question. I think we love to laugh. We especially love to laugh among friends. And we especially love to laugh about taboo or transgressive things among friends. Um, and I think the reason we like to do that is because it shows that we trust each other, and we're in a safe place with one another. If we can joke about these dark or titillating topics without judging each other and without condemning each other, that's a costly signal that we all trust each other, we all suspect each other of having the best of intentions, and we're all good, close friends, right? You could not do that with people who hated each other, right? Or mistrusted each other. And if you can do that and have a good time, then it often creates friendships. It makes you realize that you actually trust someone and think highly of them more than you thought, or they trust you and think more highly of you than you thought. They're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt for your dark, risque joke. Um, so I think Cards Against Humanity brings people together in that way. You could argue it's a kind of cope. One of the ways of coping with the tragedies and horrors of the human condition is to find a way to laugh at it. Um, there's an interesting theory of humor called the benign violation theory of humor, where it's basically what's funny is something that's threatening or unsettling or bad, but you can reframe it as safe or acceptable or okay. Um, and I think that's part of what Cards Against Humanity does, is it gives you really awful things, but it allows you to find a way to laugh at them and turn what might otherwise be horror or disgust or anger into laughter and joy. And that can provide a kind of cope. It can, be therapeutic. I've, uh, heard plenty of stories of people who have derived therapeutic benefits from Cards Against Humanity. If they went through cancer and someone plays the cancer card in Cards Against Humanity and makes a hilarious joke, it actually is healing for them. Or if their grandpa just died and someone plays My Grandpa's Ashes, that can be, really uproariously funny.
If you don't laugh, you'll
Yeah,
cry.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You flip the extremities of the emotion.
Mhm.
One of the great ways to gain status is to be funny, though. So I guess it's a vehicle for people to also be like, I don't want to say the class clown, but to be the joker and be the funny guy in the
Yes,
group. If you're super quick with the cards and you're sharper than others, and you can maybe take advantage of the gap in the sentence that other people aren't maybe as good at doing, you quite quickly elevate yourself to be the funniest player in the game and the best player in the game, which has a hierarchy to it too.
absolutely. Yeah, a lot of us don't have the privilege of being able to make people laugh. Like some people are just really gifted and they're naturally funny and they can make people laugh, but most people aren't that funny and they have a hard time making people laugh and they don't really get the joy of experiencing that. But I think Cards Against Humanity gives them that joy because it basically gives you a hand of 10 cards that were pre-written. that were carefully constructed to be, optimally funny in all the different black cards. So we're giving you all the tools you need to be funny and to make people laugh, and we're giving people the experience of being the funny person. That's something that is really precious for a lot of people.
Is it statesful to found a game and invent it?
Of course it is. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be on this podcast. My Substack wouldn't have reached you. If I was just Joe Schmo writing everything's bullshit, it probably wouldn't have been as popular as a creator of Cards Against Humanity writing it. I do bury that signal. I'm not very upfront about my involvement with Cards Against Humanity. I'm not sure if the burying has been successful in elevating my status or not. But I think it has certainly helped attract attention to the blog. I think it has, helped gain me a certain notoriety. I think it's also helped frame my writing. So there's a
Mm.
similarity between the ethos of Cards Against Humanity and the ethos of my blog, where Cards Against Humanity is very misanthropic. It's very cynical and dark. The sense of humor is very dark. It tries to, cope with the horrors of the human condition by looking at it askance and finding a way to laugh at it. My blog has a kind of similar vibe. It's also very dark and cynical and misanthropic. It often tries to make light of things that might otherwise seem depressing or awful. It tries to find the humor in it. It's kind of a blunt instrument in the way that Cards Against Humanity is often a blunt instrument. Um, and truth be told, my skill in writing for Cards Against Humanity and writing the cards and writing the copy on the website and for our various promotions, like it's a voice. And I got good at writing in that voice, and I was able to leverage that for everything is bullshit. So
Hugely transferable
yeah.
skill. Completely agree. And as you say, you do take on really dark topics, and the title "Everything is Bullshit" at the face value, and if you only read intermittently or scanned things, it could be discouraging. But one of the most encouraging articles that I read and I was nodding along to was when you were talking about suffering and how wrong we have how we view suffering. Why are your opinions on suffering so strong, David?
Um, because I think there's a whole narrative that we tell about our behavior that is completely wrong, and we don't know that it's wrong. And part of my goal with everything bullshit is tearing down this narrative. So if you think about, if you reflect on the fact that we don't really know the true reasons why we do things, and we just make up a bunch of bullshit that sounds good, well, usually how we do that is we frame our behavior as the pursuit of happiness or the avoidance of suffering. That is the most common bullshit story we tell about why we do things. And it makes sense as a nice sounding story. Yeah, we're seeking this lovely thing called happiness. We're not seeking status and approval and inclusion and special clicks. We just want we just want happiness, or we want to avoid suffering, or we want self actualization or fulfillment or meaning or self worth or excellence, or we want to avoid misery and sadness and bad vibes and whatever.
Heart,
So
yep.
this is the most common story we tell about our behavior. And it makes sense that we've converged on this story because it's kind of meaningless. It's vague. It's hard to falsify. Like happiness is the thing we want, right? And what is happiness? Well, it's the thing we want. So obviously we want the thing we want. So it's just kind of circular, right? It's this kind of like empty excuse for doing anything we want, right? So
It makes me happy, so I'm doing it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's completely empty and vapid. It's meaningless. It doesn't actually explain anything, but we say it because it's kind of unfalsifiable. It's hard to challenge, and it allows us to cover up the real motives, which are probably going to be unflattering in most cases. So it's like an all-purpose feel-good excuse for everything we do. Um, so my first post was called "Happiness is Bullshit," where I attacked the happiness end of this bullshit story, arguing that we don't actually want to be happy. And I presented a list of puzzles that don't make sense under the view that we want to be happy. Like, for example, we know that if we appreciate what we have, then we'll be happy. Yet we appreciate maybe 1% of what we have. We know that if we, slow down, take a deep breath, and just savor the moment, then we'll be happy. Yet we savor like maybe 1% of our moments.
So
Yeah,
rare.
there are so many things we could be doing to make ourselves happier that we just choose not to do. We spend time on social media, even though studies show that it actually makes us less happy in the moment, and yet we still do it, right? So we cannot be seeking happiness. That cannot be the thing that we're seeking. right? And I present a bunch of other puzzles along these lines. And I present a different story, which is that what we're seeking is largely unflattering. It's largely, it's the goals that Mother Nature gave us, that evolution gave us, like, status and, tribal solidarity and then so forth. Um, and happiness is the story we tell to cover up those unflattering motives. Um, and what happiness really is it's less of like a mental substance that we want to maximize, and it's more of a process in our heads. It's what happens when things turn out to be better than expected. So we're constantly trying to guess how things are going to turn out. We're predicting the sensations and feelings that are going to arise in the next moment. And when our predictions are wrong, well, then all sorts of emotions kick in, right? And happiness is when you predict things wrong, but in a good way, where things are way better than you expected. The ice cream tastes sweeter than you could have possibly imagined. The sex is better than you could have ever imagined. The status you get from this podcast is just through the roof. You get tons of praise and everyone's singing your name in the streets. Um, that's what happiness is. What happiness is a response to this kind of good error. When you have this kind of good error, it just recalibrates and restructures everything in your brain. Your brain's going, whoa, how did that happen? I need to figure out how this happens so I can get more of that thing. I need to shift my priorities. I need to change my beliefs. I need to change my motivation so I want more of that type of thing in the future. I need to slow down and really savor and pay attention to this thing so I can understand how it works and how it could be so awesome. That's what happiness is. But the thing is, that's not what we actually want, because happiness is kind of like the getting warmer signal in a guessing game. When you guess wrong, but you're close, you hear it getting warmer, and then you keep going in that.
It's an
It's an
indicator.
indicator, right? But when you're playing a guessing game, your goal is not to maximize the number of times you hear getting warmer, is it? If it were,
It's to be
yeah,
correct.
it's to be correct, right? If your goal was to hear the getting warmer, then you would never actually guess the thing. You would just keep guessing around the thing for all infinity, right? So our goal is not the getting warmer signal. Our goal is to guess the actual thing, right? So our goal is not happiness. And in fact, we're not so much pursuing happiness as we are chasing it away. So once we correctly anticipate what's going to happen, well, it no longer makes us happy anymore, right? The more we eat the same ice cream over and over again, the better we get at predicting it, and the less amazing it is, right? That doesn't mean that we stop wanting ice cream. I still enjoy ice cream, but it's going to be less and less good the more of it I have. And the more time away from ice cream I take, well, then it might start to get a little bit better. So when we're pursuing a goal, the better we get at pursuing it, the less happy it makes us. That doesn't mean we stop pursuing the goal. We keep pursuing it. We just get better at pursuing it.
What do you think of quotes like from Tony Robbins, like "progress is happiness"? Because for me, that's somewhat what you're indicating there. So, for example, the sales target I hit last year, if I hit the same number this year, I'd probably be disappointed. But if I hit the better number, if I have the ice cream that's got the extra sprinkles on it this time round, I'm going to enjoy it more because I've progressed the level of stimulus from what's been previous. So it's not made me, I don't maybe agree progress happiness, but we are progressive beings where we want a little bit more, a little bit higher of a dunt, a little bit of a more raising feeling or stimulus this time round.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we want progress, but we don't want happiness,
Mm.
right? It's not that
Yes.
progress is what the thing that we're pursuing is progress. The thing that we're not pursuing happiness, right? We're
Yep.
pursuing progress toward the things that we actually want. Like better food, better status, you know, better sex, whatever. Real things in the world. If you think about it evolutionarily, it doesn't make any sense for evolution to make us want something that already exists in our head, right? Because evolution could just go
Yep.
ahead and give us that thing if it wanted to, right? It's already in our
Are
head.
you familiar
Yeah,
with? Yeah, are you familiar with Dr. Meg J? She's an American author. She's got a couple of TED talks that have gone tens of millions of plays. She's been on the show twice, but her most recent book she came out, and I clipped it for TikTok, and you know what it's like when you put stuff on there. She said we're not wired to be. Your brain's not wired to make you happy. It's wired to keep you
yeah,
alive, and that completely makes sense with what you're saying there. Like our brain is not there to become this happy-go-lucky and get all this excitement and this rush of positive chemicals. It's there to make sure that you're still here tomorrow and you've got the chance to produce the next David or the next Colin down the line.
exactly.
That's how it's being driven for survival. And I think that is actually quite a helpful realization when combined with what you're saying too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started on this long tangent that I was trying to get to suffering. So I've given you the
Suffering.
backstory, and so if happiness is the getting warmer signal, then suffering is the getting colder signal, right? And just as you wouldn't want to get rid of the getting colders in a guessing game, you don't want to get rid of suffering. So if I'm playing a guessing game and I never hear it getting colder, well, I'm going to be much less likely to guess the thing. I'm going to be more likely to go on tangents and waste all my guesses on a dead end, right? Suffering is useful just as the getting colder signal is useful. It tells you that you're doing it wrong. You're heading in the wrong direction. You need to change course, right? If we didn't have that, then we would never get what we want. We would be completely ineffectual and functionless and adrift, right? So suffering is good for us. We need it. I actually did a Twitter poll where I asked people if you could take a pill that eliminates all your suffering for the rest of your life. So if you get disappointed when you fail to achieve a goal, you don't feel disappointed. Oh, oops, headphone fell off. Yeah, if your earphone falls off in the middle of an interview, you won't feel embarrassed. If your loved one dies, you won't feel grief. If someone really takes advantage of you and screws you over, you won't feel angry. If your body gets severely damaged, you won't feel pain. If you suffer a huge loss in status and everyone hates you, well, you won't feel shame and sadness and embarrassment and humiliation. Um, so I basically just listed all the negative emotions and just said all those are going to go away. Do you take the pill? And I think it was like 80% of people said, no, I'm not going to take the pill. And so that goes to show that we don't actually want to avoid suffering. I think part of us knows that it's actually useful, that it's actually good for us. That it's
We don't want to be numb.
yeah,
We don't want to be numb
yeah,
to the different emotions. And cheesy phrase, but I'll use it anyway. If you don't have the rain, you can't appreciate the sun. And that is absolutely the case with the human condition. If you were just this level being the whole time, and don't get me wrong, I really like
yeah,
stoicism. I like being quite stoic about the different
yeah,
inputs. Just before this call, we lost a pretty big tender for my day job where it'd be worth a lot to my sales
yeah,
target. But I'm fine with it. I'm pretty cool about it. Yet, but when I reflect on it, I will be disappointed, and I should expect to be disappointed. In the same way, if they emailed me 5 minutes before this call and said, "Here's the contract, sign it," I would have been elated. But you can't get too high or too low. But you must experience both high and low to even feel as a human. And we would not want to be this robotic, numb
yeah,
lifelessness.
absolutely. And we would not get any of the things that we actually care about. You would not be successful in your podcast if you never felt disappointed when you failed to meet your targets, right? The disappointment is what's steering you in towards success. If you didn't feel it, you would not achieve success, right?
Yeah, I think it's an empowering note for us to bring this home on, David, because for me, yes, we want happiness, but what we actually want is progress and feelings like we're moving towards the things that really
Yeah,
matter. But of course, all on that journey, there's going to be disappointment, there's going to be pain, there's going to be
yeah.
suffering, and we truly do need those things. But I found this so insightful. It's got my mind firing off in all different directions, and I'm sure the listeners have as well. If they want to continue the conversation with you, where should they head towards?
You can head toward everythingisbullshit.blog. That's my blog. Everything is bullshit. You can also find me on Twitter at David Pinsof. Feel free to DM me if you want. I'm friendly, despite my cynical exterior. And yeah.
Beautiful stuff, David. Both of those will be linked in the show notes. Thank you to you, and thank you to the listener. We'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.